Lecture 20, The French Revolution. The French Revolution and its horrors were prepared by Enlightenment philosophers, in particular by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. We will, therefore, first focus on how certain features of Rousseau's philosophy helped to lay the groundwork for this revolution. Then, we will turn our attention to the four phases of the French Revolution. Finally, the heroic witness to the Catholic faith during this repressive time by 16 members of the French Carmel of Compiègne and by Catholic French peasants living in Vendée will be presented. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, philosopher of the French Revolution. Although Rousseau died in 1778, a little over 10 years before the French Revolution began, his thought inspired the revolutionaries. According to the German philosopher Hannah Arendt, Rousseau's concept of a general will was adopted by French revolutionaries who were intent on establishing a single political will even at the cost of great bloodshed. And to see the connection with greater clarity, in your transcript I provide two passages, the first by Rousseau and the second where Rousseau's ideas of a general will, where people are forced to be free in accordance with the general will, are enshrined in the 1789 French Revolution's Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. The four phases of the French Revolution. The French Revolution can be divided in four ways according to four different ruling bodies: the National Constituent Assembly, the Legislative Assembly, the National Convention, and the Directory. The National Constituent Assembly. Prior to the National Constituent Assembly, France was ruled by the Enlightenment-minded Bourbon absolute monarch King Louis XVI. When the Americans were fighting a war of independence from Britain, King Louis XVI agreed to financially back the Americans, whose valiant struggle with the British King George III inspired some French to resist their own king, Louis XVI. Aiding the Americans came with a hefty price tag that increased the French government's debt. In order to find ways to pay off the debt and to address the dire situation of poor crops and rising food prices, King Louis XVI held an assembly called the States General. Since 1614, the States General had been defunct. The States General was broken into three estates: clergy, representing the first estate, nobles, the second estate, and commoners, the third estate, comprised of lawyers, businessmen, and peasants. On June 15th of 1789, in a vote of 491 in favor to 89 in opposition, the members, including many clergy, voted to change the name from the Estates General to the National Assembly, with the understanding that it was a sovereign entity not beholden to the king. A few days later, on June 20th, 1789, the king and his council responded by locking out the assembly members. That same day, in outrage, assembly members, joined by a majority of the clergy representatives and three nobles, held a meeting in a nearby tennis court. There they took the tennis court oath, reaffirming that they were France's ruling body as the National Constituent Assembly of France. Shortly after taking this oath, the finance minister of Louis XVI, Jacques Necker, was fired. This enraged many commoners, since Jacques Necker had demonstrated his concern for the poor by supporting an initiative of increasing the Third Estate's representation in the States General. After he was fired, rioting and looting broke out in Paris, culminating in the storming of the state prison at Bastille on July 14, 1789. On Bastille Day, currently celebrated nationwide in France, a mob attacked a fortress in Bastille that was holding 7 people as prisoners: a nobleman, 2 severely mentally ill people, and 4 forgers. After murdering both the governor of the Bastille and the city's chief magistrate, the mob grotesquely paraded their heads on pikes. The following month, in August of 1789, the National Constituent Assembly issued the Declaration of the Rights of Man, affirming the equality of citizens and Rousseau's notion of a general will. In this declaration, freedom was defined not from the perspective of freedom from political oppression and freedom to do anything that does not injure others. Absent from this way of defining freedom was presenting freedom as for the good, in other words, a good that is objectively true. As Catholics, we believe that only by orienting one's life towards God as the supreme good and conforming one's life to Christ as the embodiment of the good will one experience fulfillment and hence deep inner freedom and peace. As St. Augustine once wrote in relationship to Christ, our hearts are unquiet until they rest in you. The following year, in July of 1790, the National Constituent Assembly turned against the Catholic way of life by prohibiting the taking of monastic vows and by enacting a civil constitution of the clergy. This constitution required clergy to be paid by public funds and insisted that priests and bishops be elected by the people. In addition, all clerics were obliged to swear an oath of obedience to the Constitution, a requirement that, as we shall see later, King Louis XVI was reluctant to enforce. Other anti-church legislation included the 1789 abolishment of the tithe, or tax that was given to the church, some of which was used to pay clergy salaries, and the 1789 Assembly's approval and authorization of selling off Catholic Church land. The Legislative Assembly, 1791 to 1792. The governing body, the Legislative Assembly, which replaced the National Constituent Assembly, was even more opposed to the Catholic Church. Under its rule, religious orders, specifically sisters dedicated to teaching and working in hospitals, were suppressed, and their convents were sold by the government. According to some historical records, since the sisters were popular, their suppression was not well received by most of the French population. Clerical dress was also forbidden, and church funds, in addition to their property, were confiscated by the government. Priests who did not swear an oath of allegiance to the Constitution were hunted down and, if not killed, imprisoned. Their time in prison was fraught with danger. In a horrific event called the September Massacres, within the span of 3 days in September of 1792, 233 clerics were brutally murdered while in prison, and 115 other clerics, upon being discovered in a Carmelite monastery, were likewise killed. Those clergy who had sworn an oath of allegiance would also soon be persecuted. A non-violent way that the Legislative Assembly repressed the Church was by officially removing the Church's traditional civic responsibility of keeping registers of births, marriages, and deaths. The history of why it was decided to have this anti-clerical governing body replace the preceding one merits a brief overview. In 1791, the National Assembly wrote France's first written constitution, presented it to King Louis XVI to sign, which he did. According to the 1791 Constitution, France would no longer be ruled by a monarch, with absolute power aided by assemblies that were only consultative in nature. Instead, French monarchs would be held accountable to a constitution that restricted his powers by distributing some of his power to one chamber assembly, the Legislative Assembly. The king, though, was able to veto by suspending legislation sent to him, a power that he exercised. The three political parties that made up this legislative body were those who identified themselves as pro-royalists, those who were opposed royal power but in a moderate manner, and those who wanted to suddenly and radically overthrow the royalty who held power, and the radicals were known as the Jacobins. Tension between those who wanted, or at least were willing to, only gradually change the monarchical and aristocratic form of government, and those who wanted a radical break from their past of rule by one and by a few, specifically defined by those who owned property, led to a quick disintegration of the Legislative Assembly. The Jacobins, who were advocating sudden reform, emerged as the victors and, consequently, formed yet another ruling body, the National Convention. The National Convention, 1792 to 1795. A principal reason why in 1792 yet another governing body with a different set of laws was formed was how representatives for the Legislative Assembly were chosen. According to the 1791 French Constitution, electors, who were voted in by the general population, were required to be wealthy landowners. Once elected, the electors were then tasked with the responsibility of determining who would be the official representatives of the Legislative Assembly. Effectively, this meant that much of the population which was poor was excluded from voting in a representative who would best represent their interests. Naturally, this method of voting led to resentment and demands for more equal voting rights. Not surprisingly, the radical pro-democracy Jacobin Party began advocating for sudden change, and that is what occurred. After several disrupting factors coalesced, in 1792 the Legislative Assembly voted to suspend the king's rule. These factors included the following: a French declaration of war against the Holy Roman Emperor and his Austrian-based monarchy, King Louis XVI's refusal to further penalize priests who had not taken an oath of obedience to the French Constitution, and King Louis XVI's refusal to penalize people seeking to leave France. After their vote, the Legislative Assembly then called for a new governing body to be formed, the National Convention, which was to be ruled by another constitution. Once the National Convention was assembled, their first act was to abolish the suspended monarchy. Those who were extremely opposed to monarchical rule also insisted that King Louis XVI be put on trial for crimes against his country. A few of the factors that persuaded people to reject their king included the following: he had avoided receiving the sacraments from priests who had taken an oath of obedience to the Constitution, and in June of 1791 he attempted to flee the country. After his trial, in which he declared his innocence, a verdict was passed, and it was passed by one vote. King Louis XVI was to be executed, and so he was on January 21, 1793. Shortly after his execution, England, the Dutch Republic, Italian states, and Spain joined the Holy Roman Emperor's war against France. Then, a few months later, on October 16, 1793, King Louis XVI's wife, Queen Marie Antoinette, was led to the guillotine and beheaded. Prior to her unjust beheading, this royal woman, who undoubtedly was far from perfect, was slandered repeatedly, and her reputation continues to be in our present times. She was accused of being a lesbian and of excessive spending while poor people were dying of hunger. While the latter accusation may be to a certain extent true, there is no record that she ever said the cold-hearted saying, with reference to the poor, "Let them eat cake." During this third phase, when France was ruled by the National Convention, a time known as the Reign of Terror, lasted from 1793 to 1794, was promoted by the lawyer Maximilien de Robespierre. Robespierre was the chief member of the National Convention's Committee of Public Safety. On May 7, 1794, Robespierre and his Committee of Public Safety officially attempted to de-Christianize France by lending their support to the deist cult of the Supreme Being. The atheists wanted to go even further than Robespierre, who insisted that public belief in a Supreme Being is important since, and I quote from him, "it is the religious sentiment that imprints on souls the idea of the sanction given to moral precepts by a power superior to man's. Thus, I am totally unaware of any legislator who has ever been advised to nationalize atheism." End of quote. Of course, as Catholics, we not only affirm the existence of a supreme being, discoverable by natural reason, but also, as taught by revelation, a God who is triune, personal, and intimately cares for us, and is the ground of all beings, because we only have existence, while God is being. He is existence himself. Despite the brutal persecution of the Catholic Church during the Reign of Terror, research has confirmed that many lay people still practiced the Catholic faith. Some of the laity even began, to the extent they could, devoutly to follow Catholic rituals for funerals and marriages. Some even held white masses. In a white mass, bread and wine was used in a type of dry mass that lacked consecration due to the absence of a priest. Other laity reacted violently to the government's repression of Catholic priests. For example, in December of 1793, a mob of enraged peasants attacked a Jacobin club, crying, "Long live the Catholic religion! We want our priests! We want the Mass on Sundays and holy days!" Not all protests in support of the Catholic religion resorted to force. Respectful petitions were sent to governmental officials. In one such petition, sent to the mayor of the commune and parish, the petitioners stated, I quote, "We are French Republicans. We accept the Constitution. We abhor royalism. But we will never renounce our holy religion, and we will uphold it with all our power. A holy religion taught to us for more than 1700 years, and we are absolutely insistent that we will not take any other." Many women supported their Catholic faith in the face of oppression by hiding sacred images and objects that once had been in their parish churches, praying the rosary, even when ridiculed by being called priest prostitutes, and by passing on the truths of the faith to their children. In 1795, when the National Convention reluctantly permitted Catholics a limited right to publicly worship, and I quote, "Women rioted to get their churches reopened, pulling out priests from hiding to have them say Mass, ringing bells to summon other women to join them in prayers and hymns." End of quote. The number of people executed after a trial during the Reign of Terror has been carefully estimated at around 17,000. 30,000 to 40,000 more were executed without a trial. In the last months of the Reign of Terror, over 30 people were executed daily in Paris by guillotine. Interestingly, this terrifying instrument used to efficiently sever a person's head was originally invented out of a concern for a humane way of administering capital punishment. Not all were murdered by the guillotine. Other efficient ways of executed included mass drowning and setting many people before cannon fire. As described by John Marsh, the French revolutionary Jean-Baptiste Carrière invented the following efficient method for murdering people, and I quote, "Carrière devised a system for mass drownings called noyades. Boats were crammed full of prisoners, and hatches were closed. Then the boats were sunk. Once the captives had all drowned, the boats were refloated and taken back to the riverbank, ready for the next batch. Anyone who tried to clamber had their hands hacked off." At Bourgogne and Nantes, special drownings were organized for children. End of quote. Violence during the Reign of Terror was also directed against church buildings and objects of worship. The French state went even so far as to sanction the destruction of Catholic signs, crosses, confessionals, altars, and statues. Precious metals confiscated from these violated churches were then melted down and claimed by the state. In one notable state-sanctioned event of destroying religious art, the Black Virgin of Le Puy was blindfolded, put in a cart, and guillotined on the central square. And that's a quote. This intense time of violence concluded when in June of 1794, members of the National Convention, very likely out of fear that they could also be executed, turned on Robespierre and condemned him to death. Between July 27th and July 28th, on the orders of the convention, Robespierre was guillotined along with 21 others. A few weeks before Robespierre was executed, on July 17, 1794, 16 members of the Carmelite convent of Compiègne were guillotined for opposing the government's suppression of their convent. Prior to their arrest, these heroic women had been offering themselves daily to God for peace to be restored in France. It is recorded that as they walked to their death, they were praying the Salve Regina and Psalm 117, "Praise the Lord, all people." On May of 1906, St. Pope Pius X beatified these 16 members. Their story has been retold countless times in history books, novels, plays, films, and even in opera. The Directory, 1795 to 1799. A directory of 5 men, whom collectively held executive power, was formed in order to prevent one man from consolidating and abusing power as Robespierre did. Although the Reign of Terror was brought to a conclusion after Robespierre was executed, acts of violence and mass killings did not cease. One notable example is the War of Vendée, which began in 1793 under the National Convention and did not conclude until well after the Directory had been in power. During this war, the government killed Catholic men, women, and children without mercy. Approximately 200,000 people died during this civil strife, centered in the predominantly Catholic population of Vendée, which insisted on openly practicing their faith. According to the French General Westermann in his report to the Committee of Public Safety, and I quote, "There is no more Vendée. It died with its wife and its children by our free sabres. I have just buried it in the woods and the swamps of Savenay. According to the orders that you gave me, I crushed the children under the feet of the horses, massacred the women who at least will not give birth to any more brigands. I do not have a single prisoner to reproach me. I have exterminated them all. The roads are sown with corpses. At Savenay, brigands are arriving all the time, claiming to surrender. We shoot them all. Mercy is not a revolutionary sentiment." End of quote. As described by George James Hill, the greatest glory of those who fought against their unjust government in Vendée, and I quote, consisted in the fact that the Catholic religion never ceased to be openly professed in La Vendée, nor did they consent to lay down their arms until liberty of worship was guaranteed to them, and their priests were recognized and protected by the laws. Not until after Napoleon Bonaparte ended the French Revolution between November 9th and 10th on 1799 in his coup d'etat was Catholicism allowed to be practiced in all of France. For the sake of national unity, Napoleon permitted Catholicism once again to be freely practiced, and Catholicism was pronounced the religion of the great majority of Frenchmen. This decision of his may well have been based mainly on pragmatic reasons, since he wanted to rally as many people as he could behind his cause. Napoleon's pragmatic approach to life is especially evident in a 1793 letter he wrote to his brother Lucien. In the letter, Napoleon wrote, and I quote, "Among so many conflicting ideas and so many different perspectives, the honest man is confused and distressed, and the skeptic becomes wicked. Since one must take sides, one might as well choose the side that is victorious, the side which devastates, loots, and burns. Considering the alternative, it is better to eat than to be eaten." God bless.